Good morning. My name is Jake Kurtzer. I'm the Interim Director of the Humanitarian Agenda at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. On behalf of CSAS, I welcome everyone joining us online. As a reminder, you can submit live questions today, and the event will be posted in its entirety on our website shortly after its conclusion. Today's event looks at the importance of social networks in humanitarian action. To discuss these issues, we're very grateful to be joined today by Dr. Jian Kim, Senior Researcher for Resilience at Mercy Corps, Dr. Luca Cole, Acting Dean and Professor at the Africa Center for Strategic Studies at the National Defense University, and Mr. Arby Bagios, founder of Aid Reimagine. I'll begin with a short introduction and then turn it over to Dr. Kim to share with us her findings from a recently concluded Mercy Corps study on the issue. I'll then turn to Dr. Cole and Mr. Bagios for their initial thoughts and reflections from their own research, and following that, we'll have a question, answer, and discussion. Since the advent of the contemporary humanitarian assistance ecosystem, there has been some level of understanding of the importance of engaging with community actors. Even the founding of the International Committee of the Red Cross was matched concurrently with the development of National Red Cross and Red Crescent societies, which form the backbone of many humanitarian response. Over the years, there's been an increased rhetorical commitment on the part of humanitarian actors and donors to increase the integration and engagement of these so-called local actors into humanitarian response programs. And while the terminology has changed and the manner in which aid agencies are meant to do so has evolved, there has been a constant refrain on the value of organizations indigenous to the contexts and the importance of engaging with them, coming to a head at the World Humanitarian Forum in 2016, with commitments made around the primacy of local systems and the importance of reinforcing and not replacing them. However, it's also clear that the so-called localization agenda is stalled, and recent events have underscored the urgency of the agenda. First, the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic generates huge emergency needs while also disrupting the humanitarian business model, and it demonstrates vividly the importance of a localized response. Secondly, the sectoral reckoning underway, triggered by the Black Lives Matter protest movement, has led to an increased awareness of the power dynamics and resource prioritization within humanitarian action. These two events underscore the importance of continuing to understand and engage local support networks as a first step to rebalancing power within the system. So with that, I want to turn to you, Dr. Kim. You recently concluded this major study on community-based response and resilience. Would you be able to talk us through some of your key findings of the research and how you hope it will be used? Dr. Kim.
Thank you, Jake. Let me share my screen now. Could folks confirm they can see my screen?
Confirm.
Perfect. So thank you, Jake, and for the audience joining us. And I'm really excited about this opportunity. So for those of you who are not familiar, the Currency of Connection is a research initiative that was a partnership between Mercy Corps and the Feinstein International Center at Tufts University that was made possible with USAID's BHA support. So over the past 2.5 years in the United State of South Sudan and West Nile, Uganda, we conducted interviews, focus groups, and panel surveys with over 1,000 households respondents in the countries. And the initiative examined localized social protection and support systems in forced displacement contexts, the ways in which humanitarian systems can both complement and disrupt these systems. Today, given the limited time that I have with you, I'll focus on 3 findings from the initiative, drawing primarily from our final report, which recently launched, as Jake just mentioned. And I invite viewers to check out the other briefs that have been published in the series. The first point which emerged really strongly in our research is that conflict and displacement are not inherently detrimental to social connections. It is commonly assumed that conflict and displacement disrupt social relationships and support systems. And indeed, participants in our study have shared that violent conflict, displacement, and family separations have disrupted certain social connections, and especially ones based on kinship. And resource scarcity during this crisis has also led to a depletion of the amount of material support that is shared, particularly within the Bend to Protection of Civilians site, a displacement settlement, which was established to provide civilians with protection. IDPs in the POC are often separated from or have lost assets, especially cattle, in the course of their displacement. However, as Dr. Cole's own work in the Dinka communities have shown, our study also showed that households are taking intentional steps to forge new connection and strengthen existing networks in this context. And in fact, as you can see by the figure on the slide here, a majority of the IDPs living outside of the POC context report that their social networks either stayed the same or increased since their displacement. Our study found that households maintain and build social networks during crises using two important strategies: by proactively sharing material support with one another and through marriage. And while these strategies allow households to access important sources of support, they can also entail protection risks. And in context of protracted crises and displacement, socially connected households share important forms of material and intangible support with each other. And in both rounds of data collection, households report relying on a variety of social connections for help in times of need. Kin and non-kin based relationships, i.e. friends, neighbors, account for a vast majority of the sources of support reported by the respondents, as you can see on this slide. And comparatively, in times of need, households rely less on connections with livelihood and community-based groups. As you can see from this figure, households rely often more on support shared within their social networks than they do from assistance from external aid actors. Formal assistance appears to be relatively limited source of support for households, with fewer than 12 and 5% of the respondents respectively reporting that they rely on NGOs, government, traditional, and local authorities for support. The second key point that I would like to make is that while social connectedness may be a source of household resilience, it may also imply vulnerability. In South Sudan, households rely heavily on their social connections for food, access to economic opportunities, emotional support, and guidance. And this support is critical to households' ability to cope and recover in the face of shocks and stresses. And food remains the primary currency of social connections in South Sudan. The widespread practice of food sharing serves a distinct social purpose and is rooted in traditions to predate the current crisis. Historically, food sharing has been an important source of community cohesion as a means of building trust and strengthening relationship between households in South Sudan. And our study found that households that were more socially connected are better able to diversify their diets as measured by the food consumption score, as you can see in the figure here. In order to obtain additional varieties of food to complement food rations, respondents explain that they turn to their social connections, especially people who have continued to practice specific livelihoods during the course of the crisis. And households that lack these social connections, especially in the Bantu POC, may have to pursue high-risk strategies such as collecting firewood in insecure areas in order to purchase additional foods from the local market to diversify their diets. And while our analysis did not find consistent associations between household social connectedness and the household hunger scale, which assesses the more extreme forms of hunger or food insecurity, we found, as you can see on this graphic here, that households with larger social networks are more likely to experience greater hunger, even after analyses control for a variety of household and community level factors. The obligation to share material support, especially food, is deeply entrenched within the Nuer culture. So failures to abide by strict sharing norms can result in household systematic marginalization, exclusion from reciprocal support networks. And our findings also showcase that the trade-offs that households have to contend with. In some cases, households have to make the difficult choice: allocate limited resources to meet immediate needs while risking exclusion from reciprocal support networks, or share beyond their means and potentially go hungry in order to maintain and build social networks for future support. The final finding I'll briefly discuss is that humanitarian assistance can both have positive and negative effects on household social connectedness. In the context of protracted humanitarian crisis in South Sudan, in which household production capacities have declined, aid has become increasingly important and more available resource that households share to maintain and diversify their social networks. Sharing aid may be a means of securing reciprocal support, either in form of material resources such as food or cash, or as non-material support such as information, advice, or guidance. And indeed, our quantitative analysis show that households whose members have participated in more types of external programming, such as general food distributions, cash transfers, livelihood support, etc., are more socially connected with larger networks that are more diverse and reliable. And these households are also likely to be more reciprocal with their own social connections and be able to mobilize additional types of resources through their networks. Unclear or disputed recipient targeting criteria, especially when it comes to cash programming, as is illustrated by this quote here, may give rise to resentment and tension. There may be a perception that cash recipients have had their fair share and thus do not need reciprocal support from non-recipient households. And what's really important to clarify here is that the participants understood these tensions and resulting exclusion of some cash recipients from their support networks to be a function of the opaque and non-transparent targeting practices rather than the cash modality itself. So tensions associated with the provision of humanitarian assistance are often related to the lack of transparency or knowledge about the basis by which households are selected to receive cash. So that's an important point to clarify. And when local authorities explain these criteria to the community, tensions may dissipate. So to conclude my thoughts, in South Sudan, the local support systems described in this report existed well before the humanitarian actors' arrival in the country. However, to date, little attention has been paid to the understanding the effects, both positive and negative, that humanitarian assistance of various forms may have on social connectedness and related coping and recovery capacities of communities. And it is with this gap that motivated that our 2-year plus research study in the context. And our hope is, Jake, to answer your question finally, is that our study provides insights that encourage aid actors to account for local support systems in their programmatic impact and intervention logic in a nuanced and contextualized way, and to be more self-reflexive about their own role in how they may be affecting these systems through interventions. Who is included and excluded from these social networks and their related support networks, and what norms mediate these systems and relationships, and what's our role in that greater system. So I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you very much. I know it's challenging to summarize 2 years of research in 5 to 7 minutes, but I'm now going to turn to Dr. Cole and ask you to, I think, summarize probably 40 years of work experience in the same amount of time. Dr. Cole, you've worked in government and as a researcher, and you've written about the importance of the social contract in South Sudan and the concept of making a social contract as an essential part of mitigating conflict. And so from your experience, both within government and researching on this, what impact do you think that international humanitarian agencies in South Sudan have on this social contract, this social connectedness that Dr. Kim was speaking to? Do you think the presence of international organizations has disrupted the traditional structures within local communities? And what are your reflections on that issue?
Yeah, Jacob, thank you very much. Yes, I want to thank you, the CSIS, and also for Kim for such an excellent research work. For me, it is good that some of these issues are coming back, issues of vulnerability and resilience, in the context of prolonged crisis. So I just want to thank him for these findings and for the Mexico for zooming into some of these fundamental issues. I think Jacob, the most important point, as you say, the issue of situating this research in the context of social contract, because what has been seen over time, it is that this prolonged crisis and conflict are in most cases absence of a sustainable or resilient social contract. And when we look at social contract, we're looking at 2 levels, vertical relations and horizontal relations. And in most cases in conflict, the vertical relationship between the citizens and the state are weakened or even absent. And we are remaining with one very important layer, that is the horizontal relationship between and among the citizens. And this is very important that we need to realize. So it's no longer about issue of greed and grievances. And what this research is doing is really looking at this horizontal relationship between the citizen and among the citizens. For me, in most cases, most of the studies or most of the dominant thinking is that social capital is a casualty of conflict. And people tend to believe that these connections are not there or affected by the war. And that assumption actually affected badly the way people look at the intervention. And what is very important, many studies have shown these social connections, these social capital, are the ones sustaining most of the African communities over time during difficult times, and they survive. The social institutions, the social network are the one actually maintaining these. And I think it is very important that this research, what it's doing is saying, look, if we want to start anywhere, we should start what is available. And what is available for the people of South Sudan, continent, in Africa, is this social network and this social norm are the basis upon which you can be able to look at the how you can be able to intervene. I will come later on, based on my personal experience, especially in 1998 famine in South Sudan, because of lack of recognition of this fact, of the value of this social capital within the people. The intervention and targeting had been ill targeted, resulting in weakening the social institutions. And I will come later on about the targeting of food aid. And this report, this research, come out very clearly about the contextualization of the context in order to tailor the aid in such a way to understand the dynamic of social system. And so I just want to echo again the importance of looking at what people have as a starting point for any intervention. And lack of recognition of site, actually, you could see that the aid becoming not effective in responding to the existing system in the communities.
Thank you, Dr. Cole. I want to turn to you, Arby, now. You've been doing a lot of writing and research on the question of localization and rethinking the humanitarian sector. And the research behind social networks that both Dr. Kim and Dr. Cole have been talking about is sort of fundamental to understanding how to improve the localization effort. And some of your work has been, committed to the concept of decolonizing aid and recognition of local capacity. And so from your perspective, what are some of the concrete steps the international aid community, and the donor governments can take to better coordinate with the local stakeholders?
Thank you very much for that question, Jake. And thank you, Dr. Cole and Dr. Kim, for your presentation. It's really, I think it reflects my own sort of like experience and what I've seen in the humanitarian sector. In my experience, I've been part of humanitarian responses in Zimbabwe and other countries in Southern Africa for Cyclone Idai and food insecurity. And I've seen that there, it's community groups and neighbors who first respond to other people, largely because a lot of the affected communities are quite remote, and that they are, they can only rely on themselves really in the very first instance. I've seen in Bangladesh where, communities were banding together, neighbors were banding together to demand services from local authorities. And then now we see in Lebanon, for example, after the Beirut blast, people who are part of certain communities are organizing to provide humanitarian assistance to their community. And in this way, I wanted to expand the definition of community. We talk about neighbors and relatives, but also we can think of community as people who have the same interests or the same experiences. So in Lebanon, there's one instance where a community of queer people living in Beirut, they organized fundraisers for themselves because they were affected by the Beirut blast. In the Philippines, I've seen this as well. I'm from the Philippines, and I've seen how social networks have been critical in responding to the coronavirus response. I've seen lots of humanitarian assistance being mobilized by neighbors and by different communities. And I've also seen people using their social networks to organize larger scale activities. So I know, for example, there was this one person who wanted to set up an initiative that could track government funding, because the government has released a lot of money for response to coronavirus, and in the Philippines, corruption is a problem. So he organized this sort of like tracker, and then later on he mobilized this community to enlist volunteers, and now they have this huge operation tracking you know, billions of funding from the government and where this is going. I also know a community of artists who use their skills and talent to produce design and artwork to, for instance, raise awareness and provide health messaging to the public, but also to provide assistance to small businesses, you know, making design and logos such as, you know, please keep 2 meters distance or whatever. And, you know, even in the UK, we see the importance of social networks. In the UK, here in London, different neighborhoods have set up so-called mutual aid groups, where they, you know, they help neighbors and other people in the community for whatever they might need during this time of the pandemic. This, you know, this concept of the importance of local social networks, it's now beginning to be more discussed, and yeah, through research such as this. And one other research that I really like, one other piece of work that I really like is this paper called Network Humanitarianism, written by Paul Kurian, which basically discusses that, you know, there is merit in trying to make, you know, trying to advocate for a humanitarian system that is based on networks, instead of, at the moment, it's based on hierarchies, or sort of like what he calls hierarchy humanitarianism or market humanitarianism, where it's dictated by priorities and funding opportunities and strategies and plans from global north organizations, and then just imposed on global south organizations. But for Paul, network humanitarianism means, you know, really tapping into the power of networks, of local self-organization. And this goes beyond a technical issue in, you know, in the humanitarian system. It's not just about how we're organized. It's, you know, really a political issue. If I bring into this my decolonization perspective, I see 2 issues really. First is the bypassing of local networks. So oftentimes this sort of like traditional fly in, fly out models of humanitarian assistance, they bypass local networks, which, you know, is to the detriment of the humanitarian assistance because it's less effective. But another thing that I wanted to highlight is, you know, now that we're increasing on focus on local networks, there is also a risk of co-opting local networks and using local networks or local structures to pursue local objectives in the global north. A lot of big INGOs are now, you know, of course, realizing that local networks are important, and they're trying to partner with sort of like local networks and local actors, but still it is to pursue objectives that are dictated and planned in the global north. In the space of activism, they call this the NGOization of local movements. And it's, you know, it's an interesting thing to think about when, you know, looking at the history of colonialism. You know, there's lots of literature out there that sort of like typifies the different kinds of colonialism. And the one type of British colonialism, for example, is the one that utilized local governance structures to impose the British Empire, and, you know, utilized local governance structures for British sort of like interest. And then another type of colonialism is, of course, the more extractive one, which completely just bypassed local governance and local structures in indigenous lands. And it's, you know, I'm not saying that it's a direct comparison, but I think it is an interesting sort of like analogy and an interesting way to think about it. In terms of concrete steps that the humanitarian sector can take to sort of like address these things. I would say number one is to stop looking at the usual suspects and actively seek out good local humanitarian action and support and build on it where possible and where we can as sort of like wider global humanitarian sector. I think we're often blinkered by our own social networks as humanitarians. We only typically talk to other sort of like humanitarian agencies. We are blinkered by the way that we look at humanitarian action, typically in terms of sectors, not realizing that humanitarian action can take another form or can have another source. So I think we have to really search actively for good practices. Second is to democratize and humanize humanitarian bureaucracy. I think a lot of our bureaucratic practices are quite exclusive. So, thinking about the cluster system, for example, who are invited to the table? How can we bring in local networks and local actors in this one? And when I say humanize the humanitarian bureaucracy, I mean, really rethink our practices. For example, when we cooperate or collaborate with local partners, oftentimes we burden them with, like a 10-page questionnaire for due diligence. And it's not very helpful, and it's not very sustainable for smaller local actors to engage with it. And then finally, I wanted to bring out the concept of embeddedness. I think, this will not be addressed unless big international organizations really invest in their relationships and really invest in their national presence. A lot of this is around what the economist Daniel Honig, who studies the impact of local actors in development projects. It's really to do with what he calls tacit knowledge. Many local actors who work on the ground have the tacit knowledge that outsiders simply just don't have. And so let's invest in national staff, national actors, national presence, so that they're the ones who are plugged into these social networks and community groups, and they can be the one to maybe act as a bridge for community groups to connect to the wider humanitarian sector.
Thanks, Arvi. I'm just going to stay with you real quick because I wanted to ask you what are some of the obstacles, and you touched on to this kind of localization, this work. And you touched on a couple in your initial comment. You talked about the closed networks of the humanitarians, and you talked about bureaucratic procedures. But there's been a public conversation a little bit about humanitarian principles and this idea of neutrality and impartiality as these core foundational principles of humanitarian action, perhaps getting in the way because of the question of whether or not local organizations can truly be neutral and the risks associated with that. Do you think there's merit to this question of revisiting the humanitarian principles, or do you think it gets away from the structural issues, which are kind of about power and resources?
Yeah, I think this notion of impartiality and neutrality as is as necessary to humanitarian action is one of the sticky norms that we sort of like parrot within the humanitarian sector, but actually it needs to be more crucially looked at, because impartiality and neutrality works both ways. Outsiders can be seen as, allied to a particular agenda, as someone, for example, who's not invested in the community. And now, people are increasingly skeptical of foreign aid workers. There's increasing distrust of aid workers. Communities and people have access to information, and they also, many of them have access to internet and see also the conversations around NGOs, and that's also beginning to shift their own norms. So yeah, I think this needs to be rethought. Hugo Slim, an expert on the topic of humanitarian principles, recently wrote an article about this, and he says that you don't have to be neutral to be a good humanitarian, and you don't have to be an international aid worker to be neutral. And I think that this is true. The argument that neutrality and impartiality grants access to people, for example. Well, guess who also have access to people? The local communities, the local people in their own communities. So I think there's definitely, it's high time that we scrutinize this concept more.
Yeah, I think both of those points are right. I guess part of my concern is almost like you talked about the NGOization of local organizations is the potential for the conversation to become about the principles and not about funding and action. And I think that is one of my concerns is if we spend all our time discussing whether or not neutrality is important, we get away from the questions of where's the money actually going and who are the donors engaging with and who are the NGOs engaging with on the ground. I want to come back to you, Dr. Cole. In Jiyoung's presentation, she talked about international assistance cutting both ways. Potentially, it has the potential to enforce or undermine some of the social connections. And I think we just heard about that again from Arby talking about communities now have access to information and can see the skepticism. And South Sudan has long been a recipient of large amounts of international assistance. And you started to touch on it in your opening comments about the impact some of that international assistance has had. But can you speak a little bit to that question of how the international assistance has impacted the horizontal social networks within South Sudan? And what steps do you think maybe from the international community they can take, starting with the donors, to make sure that the international assistance actually reinforces the positive social networks that exist within the communities in South Sudan?
Yeah, first, Jacob, I just want to emphasize one point. I think the most important point is that aid does matter. Aid is extremely important. Aid, my own research, my own personal engagement, it helps in saving lives and livelihood. And I think this is very important for us to underscore it, and in order to make sure that sometimes, because there's a lot of discussion whether the aid it doesn't matter, but I think that's I want to highlight it, especially in the case of South Sudan. And but the question is about the effectiveness. It's just aid like oil, a windfall coming to the society. It may becoming a curse depending the way it is managed. And it is especially in the situation whereby you have a very weak institutions. And so aid, if it is not managed properly, becoming part of the dynamics of the political economy of especially in the conflict situation. So for me, I feel like one of the things in South Sudan, one of the things that I have been seeing is that because the way the aid is being targeting and is being tailored, and because what the Bogo said about the issue of neutrality and the assumption that you don't have a state functioning, you have the rebels using the aid itself in order to pursue their insurgency warfare. So you have a problem of lack of trust in terms of how you can be engaged and using aid, because so you have those risks in terms of to what level can you be neutral, to what level can you be able to access, given the fact that the aid itself is being used to becoming part of the machinery of the warfare, because if you don't handle it. And then you have you have a limitation also of how best you can ensure, how can you get access to the citizen, given the fact between you, the aid actors, and the communities you have in between the gatekeepers. In most cases, these are the rebels or the government, becoming so difficult for you even to reach the communities. But even the moment you reach the communities, and I think it came out from the report very well from Kim report, that is, for example, I was engaged in the in South Sudan with Save the Children Fund on early thinking about how can we understand the economy of the people. And one of the good approaches is the food economy approach. And in one of the components is exactly this social network. It's one of the things being considered in assessing the community capabilities. And the problem with that approach is that it is just only way to capture, but it has not been used to zoom in to understand the dynamics of these social networks in terms, and one of the things I found very interesting from this report is that it is through social network can help in terms of the resilience, but it can pose even the community to become vulnerable, because that is about the dynamic of powers and all these things. So even though we may have a very good idea about how it is perceived, but I think a lot of work to be done to contextualize that idea of social networking. And that's why in Southern Sudan, during the targeting, for example, to give you an example, having during the famine a very limited amount of food aid to be targeted, and then you have a problem. How can you target a so limited amount of food to huge needs? And then there was perception that women are the most vulnerable, the women are the one cooking. So these are the people that we should be able to target food aid. And then they have these relief committees, and then these women out of the village of 100 people, only to target about 25 people household. And then a woman is given a chance in order to say, we call it the woman of a stick, to identify who to be targeted. And you could see clearly. So the exclusion error is so huge, about 75% of people will not be targeted. And then you have assumption that this woman is the only person who can be able to target food aid. So you exonerate, the international community exonerate themselves from the responsibility of the year. And putting these women through this assumption that women are the most likely to target food aid, making that woman to becoming so vulnerable to the society. And I remember at early stage, I was watching how the elders and the communities were watching on, this is the white man food aid. And they have their own social network. Even these leaders, they have the responsibility towards their own citizen. And what happened is this is now the responsibility of the white person. This is the aid itself. So I think it is one of the areas whereby not knowing these social networks and the dynamics, I think it's very important, the aid itself it could exacerbate the tension and because by the end of the aid is going, people will be living by themselves. And the most important thing I think came out from this report, understanding the context very well. It is true we cannot idealize these social networks are the panacea for you to solve all the problems, because they have a lot of dynamics that we should be careful. And I think the context is becoming very important. And that is why the aid actors should have skills to understand and zoom in to understand these dynamics at the local level before you started happening. And that's why one of the things I like from this research, the two phases approach in order to understand better, and even the fact that you have to get the context, get the right intervention in order to be able to get the year. So I think, but then I just want to underscore it is the way aid is managed and how can we be able to channel it in such a way to understand the context could make a huge difference to the communities. Let me stop here.
Thank you. I want to come back to you, Gian, as we start to run close to time. So Dr. Cole talked about increasing our contextual analysis, and I'm just thinking, in the course of your research, what other techniques are effective in both understanding the nature of the social networks and effectively engaging with them? And I think, fundamentally, these are all external interventions. And so there's always going to be some level of disruption. So how do we manage that disruption the most effectively to make sure that the interventions are achieving that reinforcing function? And then I'll just ask you a second question right now. You wrote recently about COVID as being something that has a potential also to disrupt, so if you could also speak maybe about the broader scope, but then maybe we can kind of come to that question about the pandemic and how this has disrupted things, and what, if there's a takeaway from the specific context we're dealing with now, that we can think about as we look at the sector more widely?
I think, thanks, Jake. I'll ambitiously try to tackle 2 of those questions in the next 3 minutes. So I think to the first question, one thing that was really powerful about this research is we invested a lot of time with a team of tireless South Sudanese researchers to really unpack what's going on. So we didn't want to come in as external researchers with preset definitions of what social connectedness look like. And instead, we spoke with people to capture their lived experiences and developed an index that represented what social connectedness looked like from people in the context. And so for us, that was a really powerful opportunity. And that underscores a really important point. As Dr. Cole said and RB has mentioned, contextualization and nuances are really key. There has to be some level of investment made to unpack and understand. And I think the point that I mentioned earlier at the outset is self-reflexivity. I think there's always good intentions at heart to jump in and try to supplement or complement, but sometimes these informal groups that form, they're best left alone. And so just trying to do a cost-benefit analysis or just understanding what is my added value in this space? What am I bringing? Am I a disruptor, or am I actually strengthening these existing networks? So I think just that level of reflection and thinking through how am I putting the social connected lens to this intervention and programming at large, and unpacking it from not my perspective, but people who are actually living through this experience. I guess that's a very quick overview. Turning to the pandemic to take us out, I think we wrote about this recently in a recent piece in CSRF. And while the impact of COVID remains to be seen on social networks, and in South Sudan, there is underestimated number of cases likely due to social stigma and limited testing of 2,000 plus cases, I think the likely relationship is going to be bi-directional. On one hand, the disease and its secondary effects are likely going to disrupt important bases of social connections and support, with implications for household resilience during the crisis. The pandemic and the public health measures to stop the disease spread in South Sudan will disrupt social functions, public gathering to bring people together, where they're trying to strengthen existing ties, exchange information, etc. And there's anecdotes already of church services, football games, and parties being canceled in effort to curb. And these measures are also likely going to undermine productive livelihood groups that are often practiced in close proximity in informal association. And social distancing measures and mobility restrictions may disrupt, for example, fishing or cattle keeping associations in rural parts of the country. And as a result of the violent conflict and the protracted crises, these groups have become really important and a crucial vector of socioeconomic social connectedness, as we write about in our report. In addition to these localized effects, the global reach of the pandemic and the disruption to the livelihood for the South Sudanese diaspora, and in turn their reduction in their ability to send remittances back, are likely going to have a huge effect in the World Bank and others in this space have written about that in anticipation of what may come. On the other hand, to wrap up, social connectedness is likely to influence the ways in which the pandemic affects households and the extent to which the disease can be contained. So an important example of this is the role that information plays in crisis. So social connectedness can influence whether information is trustworthy and acted upon, as other panelists have spoken to, and as whether the information can be accessed in the first place. So for those who are interested in this, in CSRF, we write down some concrete recommendations of potential initial steps that people can think about the pandemic with the social connectedness lens. But I think the final thought is there's more to be unpacked here. We're trying to unpack these dynamics in Yemen in an ongoing study right now. But I think it remains to be seen.
Thanks for that. Cognizant of our time, I just want to flag, I don't think we'll have time to go through the Q&A, but I want to flag some of the questions that have come up from the audience, because I think they speak to some of these issues. I mean, we have one question about whether or not, involving local communities means changing the fundamental business model of international humanitarian assistance. We have another comment here about the gatekeepers being a well-articulated problem that international assistance reinforces existing power structures. And then there's something, there's a comment here about funding being obviously not the only issue, but practically the funding models are an important element here. And how do we work to shift funding directly to local organizations? And I think these are all really important questions. And Arby, you reflected on the Lebanese, the disaster at the port earlier this year in Beirut. And I remember seeing such a massive social media effort towards the Lebanese Red Cross, which may be kind of an existing humanitarian organization, but it was very much the idea of like, don't give money to the US-based organization. The Lebanese Red Cross is there, they know what to do. And I think that that's a really important element here. So given the time, I think we're gonna stop it here, but I wanna remind our viewers, one, Dr. Kim and Mercy Kaur's paper is available, The Currency of Connections, easily Googleable, and direct people to Arby's blog, Aid Reimagined, and your very active Twitter feed. And thank all of you for participating in this conversation and for the work that you're doing now and in the past and going forward. I think this is the topic in the humanitarian sector. And so thank you very much for your time today, and we wish you all the best.